My name is Pastor Jim. I'm the privilege of being one of the pastors here at the South Weymouth Church of the Nazarene. If you're visiting with us or haven't been here for a little bit, welcome here. Welcome home. It's good to have everyone gathered together today. Today we're going to center a little bit around the scriptures as the community gathers. The Lord bless you. That's one of the many blessings in the book of Ruth. One of the things that we hadn't got a chance to look at too terrifically is the way that the author incorporates blessing into the broader story of Ruth. 7 times in 4 chapters is a very particular blessing offered. And so we wanted to start our service today with a blessing. Let me welcome you to the conclusion of our summer series in that Old Testament book of Ruth. It's been my privilege to walk our community through this captivating story of faithfulness and love. Faithfulness and love. Faithful love. It's the Hebrew term chesed, and it's used a lot in the book of Ruth to talk about what this bonding, faithful love really means. And this chesed, this faithful love, competes with the major theme of the book for a priority. And that major theme, of course, is redemption. And redemption is God's ability to rework the mess of our tragic lives, giving it meaning and purpose and fulfillment. And so over these past several weeks, we've been learning that the book of Ruth has this really dark and ominous beginning, right? And every week we step up to address a new chapter, and we remind ourselves that as the book of Judges closes and the book of Ruth opens, we're reminded that in those days there was no king in Israel. And so everyone was left to do what was right in their own eyes. And what they were actually doing, maybe largely unbeknownst to anybody, was evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so that doesn't paint a very good beginning for our story. And then we quickly learned that there was a famine in all of Israel. And so the community of Bethlehem literally means house of bread, is suddenly without bread. There's no food in, God's not providing food. And Pastor Dave said nobody went hungry. Well, that wasn't the case in Ruth's experience. And then no king in Israel, a famine in the nation, moved a family to make some very unwise, I would say some faithless decisions. They moved their family out from the protection of God's promised land, the covenant, the stipulations, and they moved themselves into a foreign land, the land of Moab. And while in the land of Moab, Naomi she had her husband and she had 2 sons, and her 2 sons married women from the land of Moab, which is something the Lord had specifically commanded God's people not to do. And so there is a series of kind of faithless acts. And then while she's in Moab, she experiences this tragic loss. All of the men in her family die. Her husband and her 2 sons, leaving 3 widows in the land of Moab. So the beginning section of the book of Ruth starts with this ominous beginning. And it paints a picture of Ruth, whose life has almost burned to the ground. It leaves her heartbroken, vulnerable, and bitter. And this is how our story begins. And yet, in an expression of this chesed, this faithful bonding love, Ruth the Moabite, one of her daughter-in-laws, will not leave Naomi to suffer alone. She clings to her mother-in-law and declares, as if she declares, Naomi, where else am I going to go now? My only home is with you. And so wherever you go, that's where I go. And whoever your people are, they're going to be my people. And where you stay, that's where I'm going to stay. And whoever you serve as God, that's who I'm going to serve as God. And where you die, that's where they'll bury me. Ruth has proven herself faithful in her commitment to Naomi over these 3 chapters, demonstrating this bonding love. Now, Naomi also expresses the same kind of love to Ruth. And so in our last week, chapter 3, we learned that Naomi says, hey, Ruth, I have got to find a husband for you. I've got to find a home for you where you can be provided for and you can still have a chance to live a full life. And so last week we were left waiting with Ruth to see if Naomi's plan had actually worked. Chapter 3 closes with these words. Naomi says to Ruth, wait here, my daughter, until you find out what happened. And so all week long, we've been waiting here with Ruth, trying to find out what happened. And today we find out what's happening. And we'd invite you to follow along with Taya as she draws us back into the story of Ruth, chapter 4.
Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there, just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one here has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David.
May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his word. Amen. In chapter 4, the author pulls on all of those kind of loose ends that we've been kind of hanging on as we move through these last 3 chapters. As he draws on them, he pulls them all tight together into a tapestry of redemption. And there is, in fact, so much more going on in Ruth chapter 4 than we could ever address in a single sermon, even the very long sermon. Today, I want to draw our attention to 3 important lessons that we learn from this book of Ruth, particularly from chapter 4, as it draws us to a conclusion. So if you're taking notes, or if you have your app open, or wherever, or if you're one of those people not like me who can just keep track of all of that in their mind through the kind of meandering of a sermon, then note the first point. Here's the first lesson. Ready? God is able and often chooses to work his grand plan of redemption through imperfect people. Aren't you glad? To say this another way is to say that Yahweh is actively stirring about in the messiness of life. Or maybe even to say it more personally, God is at work in you. And God is at work in me. And God is at work in us. God is able, often choosing to work his plan of redemption through imperfect people. Let's just say, for sake of argument, that your road to redemption has been less than ideal. Your road to redemption has been a little less than ideal. Maybe you were not brought up in a Christian home. Or maybe you're not a fourth generation Nazarene. Or maybe you don't know the first thing about all of the great influencers of Christian thought like Augustine and Luther and Wesley and Forrest Franks. Maybe, let's just say your road to redemption travels through abuse or addiction or trauma. Or maybe you've walked down streets of violence and anger and intimidation and bullying. Or maybe you've ridden a few miles with some less than stellar companions like mental dysfunction or anxiety or darkness or hopelessness or confusion. You know, one of the things that we learn from Ruth's story is that our imperfections, the messiness that entangles our lives, that sometimes come to the surface and threaten to define us, those things, they don't stop God's work of restoring, mending, healing, and recreating us. God can and often does work his plan of redemption through imperfect people. I'll tell you a story of a girl we know. She was pretty and funny and bright, and yet pretty naive, I think, about the dangers of real life. She grew up fairly sheltered. She attended an all-girls Catholic school. She was involved in the youth program and at the church with a strong family and social life. But her new man interest was older than she was by about 3 years, which doesn't seem like too much, but if you're talking about a high school age girl, that's a pretty decent sized gap. He is a Christian, at least that's what he says. She's never heard him pray, and they don't really attend church together. Still, he was strong and handsome and popular and respectful. He called her mom ma'am and her dad sir, and she always got a kick out of that. I mean, she knew the Lord's commands, that the commands of the Lord are in place for her good. She knew the Lord's instructions were those set in place to safeguard her life. And she knew what God expected of her, particularly in the realm of relationships. But in the end, she had to admit that her pregnancy was not the result of a one-time, one-night thing. It was, in fact, the result of a progression, a series of small compromises that led her down a path as she never intended to walk, to travel, until finally she couldn't stop the momentum moving down that path that she had never intended, and that ended in that only a one-time, one-night thing, a selfish, regrettable act. A faithless expression changed her life. Refusal to trust God with the God stuff, or failure to live under the care and instruction of God, that releasing yourself from his covenant protection increases difficulties in our lives, brings about more pain than necessary, and it complicates things. So this one child of God, this member of Christ's church, took matters into her own hands, and she acted on what she thought was right to her in her own eyes. You know, she used to have her whole world out in front of her. Like she could have moved in any direction. She could have followed Jesus anywhere along the adventure of her faith, but life is controlled by this squawking, curly-haired little dictator screaming at her from the bassinet. Late night feedings and runny noses and fevers, midday doctor's appointments and minimum wage jobs that aren't going to end anywhere, sleepless nights and endless days. You know, combined with this overwhelming sense of her own shame and regret, thinking that her newborn little girl deserves so much better. She deserves a daddy that's married to her mommy. Well, and mom certainly needs help and loving support, because children were not designed to be raised by just one parent. Young teenage girls were not designed to take on all of the caring, nurturing responsibilities of motherhood. And we thank God for the church that came alongside of her. We thank God for loving Christian parents, both committed to helping fill the gap left by faithless act. But if we would fast forward 25 years from that point, we'd find that baby born that day, graduated top of her class at one of our Nazarene institutions. She's midway through her law degree at Rutgers University with an emphasis on international law. She is recently married to a wonderful Christian man, and they're active members and supporters in their small local church where they're exploring God's call to cross-cultural missions. Because our story is a story of redemption. We believe in a God who can take the faithless acts or the messiness that we make of our lives and how we tangle ourselves in the complicated things and rework them, recreate them all for his glory. And so we learn from our story that our faithlessness does not paralyze God. That we learn that our doing what is right in our own eyes does not cripple his redemptive mission, not in our lives, not in the world. God is faithful to us even as God expresses his binding, faithful love, as he embodies chesed in our own lives. His love is not contingent upon our ability to live within the confines and the stipulations of his covenant parameters. Naomi and Ruth did not start from a great place. They started from a mess. Their story is not a beginning story of obedience to God's law. They began the journey of redemption having made a mess of things and doing what is right in their own eyes. One thing, however, they do really, really well, and that is they demonstrate the faithful, bonded love. They act in love. Their lives in relationship are governed by love. They seek the best for one another, and that's really what love does. It seeks the well-being of another person, especially when it costs you something. They act in love. Love draws the attention of God, and it moves him to work redemptively. So first point. God is able to work redemption through imperfect people. Yahweh is actively stirring around in the messiness of life. He is at work in me. He is at work in you. Secondly, redemption flows through faithfulness. This is what we learn from our story in Ruth. Redemption flows through faithfulness. Faithful people are those who have given themselves to God in this kind of radical trust and obedience. Faithful people are those who have let go of everything else in order to love well. Where else am I going to go? My only home is with you. Even those who have been abandoned, even those who have consciously abandoned their faith in God and have set about doing what seems right in their own eyes, can always, once again, find a place among the faithful if they will choose. Because ours is a story of redemption. Even when we've blown it and messed everything up, and when we've turned our back and we've walked away, we can turn down the road to redemption and we can come back home. We can experience the restoration of faith formed in us and welcomed back into the family. See, Naomi's story of faithlessness begins to change, and everything starts to turn around when she makes her decision to go back home to Bethlehem. It gains momentum with the radical love bond that she and Ruth share, this deep sisterhood. And it changes again when Boaz he is introduced as the faithful man of God. If Ruth is an example of this radical binding love, then Boaz is an example of someone who faithfully lives out the covenant promises of God, not just in the big things like the life-changing events like who you should marry or if you should go to college or work in the trades or the military, like those big events like how will you serve humanity, or should you go with an iPhone or an Android, those big major life decisions. Boaz is described as someone who not only is faithful in big life decisions, but also in the small moment-by-moment choices too. How we treat people, the kind of person that we are in public and in private. How we conduct our business, how we tell the truth, how reliable we are. What is our commitment to excellence? Boaz was faithful in the small and the large things. Here are two examples. First of all, he allows for the poor and the underprivileged to glean necessary food from his fields right after a long time of famine. He not only provides for those in his community who might need this assistance, but he goes over and above what the law would require of him to have them glean from some of the best of the harvest, a faithful act. Now, and although here's a second way of maybe how Boaz was faithful in the big things. And although, it's clear throughout the first 3 chapters of the book of Ruth that Boaz has taken an obvious interest in Ruth, he will not act unfaithfully to obtain her or take advantage of the situation for his own personal gain. He recognizes faithfully that there is another in line, an unnamed kinsman redeemer. This one must first be given the option to secure Naomi's land and provide a son to carry on the family name. Boaz is faithful in the small things, and he's also faithful in the large things. As it turns out, of course, the unnamed kinsman has no interest in adding another wife to his household, and he allows Boaz to faithfully proceed with God's redemptive plan. The redemptive mission of God is greater than the faithlessness of Naomi's family, who took matters into their own hands and did as they saw fit. Yet through the faithfulness of Ruth and through the faithfulness of Boaz, Naomi, a daughter of Israel who has returned home disgraced and bitter, has now experiencing the joy of God's redemption. Life has come full circle for her. She came to Bethlehem empty and bitter, and now Naomi has a son, an heir, someone to care for her in her growing old age. God took in the imperfect mess of her beginning, riddled with mistakes, and he worked salvation and redemption through the faithfulness of Ruth and the faithfulness of Boaz. What made the difference? What changed it all for Ruth? Let me just say it this way. Isn't it interesting how a little boy born in the little village of Bethlehem can change the hopeless, bitter results of faithlessness into new life, joy, support, and security? Our first lesson this morning is that God is able to work redemption through imperfect people. Second lesson is that God brings redemption through faithfulness. And then lastly is this: the scope of God's redemption is always larger than we think. What God is doing is always bigger than what it appears on the surface. You and I, we could easily have read through the book of Ruth together and concluded that this is a story about how God found Naomi in a mess of bad decisions. She was vulnerable, without hope, bitter, and then God chose to redeem her life, as if God were showing off and saying, "Look at this poor person. Look at what kind of pain they're in. Watch what I can do." And he restores the daughter of Israel. And the lesson would be a good lesson. The lesson would be that no person is too far forgotten for God. And no person is too far gone. And nobody is unredeemable. That's a great lesson. And it's true. And it preaches. And we probably should preach that more often. It's true, but it's not the whole truth. It's good, really good, but not good enough. I think the reality is that the scope of God's redemption is always greater than what we think it is. God's dreams are bigger and larger and they always tend to exceed the boundaries of our own little world and our own little lives. God is doing something so much larger than restoring a daughter of Abraham, Naomi. God is doing something so much larger than incorporating one Moabite into the Israelite faithful family, Ruth. And God is doing so much more than rewarding a noble man for his faithfulness to the covenant, Boaz. Don't you see? The national problem that we encountered at the beginning of our story. In those days, there was no king in Israel, so everyone was left to go about doing what was right in their own eyes. Judges chapter 21, verse 25, and Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. Our story begins in the days of Judges. But it finds its resolution in chapter 4, verse 21 and 22. Solomon was the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David, the king. Suddenly there is a king in Israel now. What was lacking at the beginning of her story finds its resolution at the end. Now there is a king of Israel. And listen, in the span of 86 verses, we went from having no king to having a king. But think even bigger than that. So that by the time we reach the first chapter of the New Testament, we've gone from having no king to having a king, and then are then introduced in Matthew chapter 1, verse 17, to the King of Kings, to the very King of Kings. The scope of what God is up to in the world extends far beyond the boundaries of our own little lives. In just 86 verses, God is active, not only redeeming a small, vulnerable family, not just a whole nation of Israel, but the whole wide world. 14 generations from Abraham to Babylon, 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to Babylon, 14 generations from exile to Joseph and Mary and Jesus. The whole world. So, our vision is often so narrow, we want to look at how God can redeem me. And how can God redeem my family in the mess that we find ourselves in? But what God is really up to is so much larger than my own little world. The Lord is working to capture you, yes, and me, in our vulnerable messiness. And we've made a life for ourselves, but we've entered into new life in Jesus. But the scope of that restoration is so much larger than the immediate impact on my own little world. Often it seems like we've treated the beginning of our walk as if it were the end of our walk. We look to be delivered from the messiness of life and restored to the community of faith. And when we are delivered from the messiness of life and restored to the community of faith, we say, thank God. I'm glad that's over. And now I'm one of the chosen ones or whatever. But our text for this morning challenges us to think bigger, to think globally. That the chosenness, the redemption that we experience, and the incorporation into the faithful is just the beginning of all that God is doing in our community and in our nation and around the world. The redeemed life that we live is designed to have an impact on our family for generations, to our community, and yes, even our nation and our world. Friends, I want us to think bigger and more globally, so that after we've been restored and after we've been redeemed, the question is, what are we supposed to do now? Well, now, of course, you download a Bible app and you learn how to pray and you show up to small groups and you come to worship if you don't have anything else better to do on a Sunday morning, and you serve when it's not such an inconvenience, and then you discover the book of Ruth and you're challenged to think a little bit bigger. What could God actually be up to that extends beyond the boundaries of my own little world? That asking God for forgiveness and accepting His love and grace for our lives puts us at the start of our journey, not the end of our journey. God is not simply interested in saving our soul. He does not redeem us for our own personal happiness and enjoyment and eternal security. His plans are far bigger than that. He doesn't send us to NYC or to teen camp or to give us this kind of experience so that we can have a good experience. God saves us for a reason and a purpose. And the scope of God's redemption is always bigger than what is happening in my own little life right now, so that redemption flows into our imperfect, messy lives through faithful people. So ask, who are the Ruths in my life? The Boazes, that have committed themselves to me in this bonding kind of love and modeled faithfulness, so that we can in turn take our place in the partnership with God in this big, massive restoration project for the world, so that we come to realize who we are becoming matters. And what we do in our world matters more than we realize. And then maybe the failure to engage in God's mission will have some negative repercussions that ripple out into generations still to come. And likewise, your example of faithful bonding love and living out your redemptive story and stepping in to take your place in the mission of God will also have its positive effects, assisting generations of Christians that are still left to follow and those that we will take with us. God has destined us to be a faithful people who fully participate in his plan to redeem the world. Right now, we have the opportunity to affect generations of fellow sojourners, those who will come behind and those who will go with. Some will live their lives in radical obedience and commitment. They will resemble Ruth and Boaz in the world. They'll be used by God to see redemption flow into the lives of others. Who we become really, really matters. And what we do really matters. The scope of God's redemptive activity is always larger than it appears on the surface. You think that Ruth and Boaz and Naomi had any idea? That was typical New England, right? Put an R at the end where there's an A. Any idea at all that their little baby boy, Obed, born in the small village of Bethlehem, would be the grandfather of the great king? Was that their plan all along? It's very doubtful. You think that faithful Boaz was thinking, if I just leave enough grain, some poor widow and some starving people in my town might take notice and God would use me to save the world? That wasn't Boaz's thought. You think that who we become doesn't matter? My little contribution doesn't make sense to the kingdom. So small, so insignificant. Who we become and what we do has repercussions. The good news this morning is that God is able to work redemption in the lives of imperfect people, vulnerable people, people prone to mistakes. And that he brings that redemptive plan through faithful people who operate in love and obedience. He brings about his redemptive plan through people like Ruth who say, where you go, I go. Where you stay, I stay. Your God's going to be my... And also people like Mary who said, let it be unto me, just as the Lord has commanded. And then lastly, God's redemption is bigger than it appears on the surface. The scope of God's plan is global. If we're going to become the faithful people of God, we must experience his redemption for ourselves. And then we must live lives of radical, bonding obedience, because God is doing so much more in us and through us than we are aware. It's the kind of people that we become matters. What we do or what we fail to do, it matters. So, for our sake, and for the many who will come behind us, and for the many who will take with us, here's the challenge today. Let us live lives of faithful obedience to our King, who has bonded himself to us in love. We're going to sing our benediction this morning, but I want to pronounce this blessing over you. May God's redemption flow into your life and renew your strength well into old age. For the gift of Jesus is better to you than all of the sons and daughters of Israel. He will give you newness of life. For this promise is for you and for your children and their children for 1,000 generations.